Listen closely. What I'm about to explain is unfolding right now. And it's no longer just about tariffs. Canada has taken a step that caught Washington off guard. And not symbolically, genuinely off guard. Because for the first time in a generation, Canada isn't reacting defensively. It's reshaping the economic balance of North America itself. While attention is fixed elsewhere, here's what almost no one is discussing. When tariffs jumped to 35% last August, most observers expected a familiar outcome. Canada would bend. Do what it usually does. Quiet talks behind closed doors. Small compromises. Protect access to U.S. markets at all costs. That's always been the formula. That's how this relationship has worked for decades. But here's where things change. In March 2025, Mark Carney became Prime Minister. Former head of the Bank of Canada. Former head of the Bank of England. Not a traditional politician. This is someone whose entire career revolved around leverage, risk, and pressure dynamics. And everything happening now suggests this response wasn't improvised. It's been in motion for months. 3 weeks ago in Davos, Carney delivered a speech that didn't dominate headlines, but quietly shifted the ground. Speaking to global economic leaders, he said the rules-based global order isn't evolving. It's breaking. And that middle-power countries like Canada must stop bargaining from vulnerability and begin building real strategic independence. Then it escalated. Just 2 days later, Canada finalized a $7 billion trade agreement with China, covering energy, agriculture, and critical minerals. Not a symbolic deal, a diversification move, a clear signal that Canada is reducing total reliance on U.S. demand. And sources say this wasn't limited to canola or EV components. It was about establishing alternative channels for Canadian output. The reaction from Trump was immediate. He threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian imports if the deal proceeded. 100%. That's not negotiation, that's economic force. Shortly after, Carney's invitation to Trump's Board of Peace was withdrawn. The message was unmistakable. Comply or pay the price. But that's not the real story. The real story is what Canada has been doing quietly while headlines focused elsewhere. Because while tariff threats dominated the news, Canada was re-engineering its exposure, not retaliation, restructuring. And that distinction is everything. Internal documents show this effort has been underway for months, diversifying supply chains, redirecting energy exports, locking in critical mineral processing agreements with Europe and Asia, attracting capital from non-U.S. sources. This isn't emotional, it's calculated. And what comes next changes the entire picture. Canada's strategy isn't about winning a tariff battle in the usual way. It's designed to make tariffs impose as much pain on the United States as on Canada, possibly more. And it's happening through 10 coordinated moves that most people aren't tracking yet. This is the part that kept me awake. Each move targets sectors where pressure is felt immediately by American workers, companies, and politicians. Auto manufacturing, agriculture, energy, infrastructure, technology procurement. These effects don't show up instantly in trade data, but they become politically unbearable within weeks. So the real question isn't whether Canada can withstand tariffs. It's what happens when a country supplying roughly 40% of U.S. crude oil, the majority of electricity imports, and key EV battery minerals decides it won't operate as a junior partner anymore. Stay with me, because what follows is how Canada is translating U.S. pressure into U.S. cost, sector by sector, decision by decision, and why this approach may actually succeed. Let's start with Action 1, automotive supply chains. Canada isn't simply threatening tariffs on vehicles, it's tightening border inspections, enforcing stricter rules of origin. In practice, that means even minor customs delays throw American production schedules into chaos. Plants in Michigan and Ohio begin cutting shifts. And the key point is this: trade doesn't need to stop to create pressure. Friction alone is enough. Recent data shows clearance times are already creeping upward, not dramatically, but enough to trigger emergency meetings among logistics teams. In auto manufacturing, timing is unforgiving. A 2-day delay can shut down an entire assembly line. And when that happens, workers notice, unions notice, and lawmakers from auto-dependent districts start calling Washington. Action 2, electric vehicle minerals. Canada holds vast reserves of lithium, nickel, and cobalt, the backbone of EV batteries. Instead of banning exports outright, Canada is prioritizing domestic processing and long-term contracts with European and Asian buyers. These agreements quietly lock up supply years in advance. For U.S. EV manufacturers, the risk isn't immediate. It emerges 18 months down the line, when production ramps up and reliable mineral supply is already committed elsewhere. Costs rise, timelines slip, investors start questioning supply security. Action 3. Energy redirection. Canada supplies about 40% of U.S. crude oil. At the same time, it's accelerating LNG projects aimed at Asia, West Coast pipelines, expanded export terminals. These aren't emergency pivots. They're existing projects moving faster. Over the next 3 to 5 years, this reduces Canada's dependence on U.S. energy demand, and less dependence means more leverage. Energy contracts are long-term. Once redirected, they don't snap back easily. Path dependence takes hold. Action 4. Agriculture. Canada introduced tighter quotas and inspection standards on U.S. beef, corn, and soy, not bans, restrictions. The result is immediate inventory pressure, excess supply, falling prices, and farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas feel it before anyone in Washington does. That's why this works. Agricultural states wield disproportionate political power. When farm income dips, senators react fast. This stops being abstract trade policy and becomes direct political pressure. Action 5. Logistics. Canada is rerouting container traffic away from U.S. ports toward Canadian corridors. Prince Rupert, Vancouver, Halifax. The shift is gradual but consistent. Ports lose fees. Warehouses lose volume. Transport jobs face uncertainty. And once shipping patterns change and infrastructure follows, reversal becomes costly. Distribution centers don't relocate on impulse. Actions 6 through 10 are even more structural. Infrastructure procurement criteria now favor localization, supply security, and technical standards, not explicit exclusion. Quiet displacement. Over time, U.S. engineering and construction firms lose access to billions in contracts. Defense and aerospace procurement follows the same logic. Supplier diversification. Maintenance sourcing changes. These contracts support entire industrial ecosystems. When they move, jobs move. Digital infrastructure comes next. Canada is requiring sensitive government data to remain outside U.S. jurisdiction, favoring non-American cloud and cybersecurity providers. No tariffs, just lost long-term contracts. And in the modern economy, control over data shapes future competitiveness. Financial pressure follows. Pension funds and institutional investors are slowly rebalancing portfolios toward Europe and Asia. Small shifts send signals. In a trade war, capital reacts sharply to volatility. Reduced inflows mean higher financing costs over time. Finally, legal and diplomatic channels, WTO disputes, coordination with allies. These processes are slow, but they shape perception, and perception influences investment just as much as profit. These 10 moves aren't random. They reinforce each other. Each converts external pressure into internal American cost. Auto workers feel it, farmers feel it, energy firms feel it, tech companies feel it. When enough groups feel pain simultaneously, political endurance erodes. This isn't just a trade dispute, it's Canada redistributing tariff costs back into the U.S. economy. And now comes the deeper strategy. Canada is trying to prove 5 things at once. First, economic sovereignty is real, not symbolic. For decades, markets assumed Canada would absorb losses to preserve access. That assumption created leverage. Canada is showing it can take pressure without surrendering. In trade wars, endurance determines who sets the rules. Second, Canada has alternatives. U.S. trade still matters, but it's no longer exclusive. The China deal demonstrated optionality. Europe and Asia are accelerating talks. In global economics, optionality equals power. Third, employment protection. Jobs at home are no longer bargaining chips. Auto manufacturing, EV supply chains, infrastructure, data services, these anchor communities. Prioritizing domestic value creation stabilizes politics during prolonged conflict. Fourth, rules over transactions. Canada is aligning with partners that value predictability: Europe, Japan, South Korea. As volatility increases, reliability becomes scarce, and scarce assets attract capital. Fifth, and most important, Canada will no longer absorb shocks for free. Cooperation remains the goal, but not submission. Reciprocity and shared cost are now conditions. In August, Canada dropped most retaliatory tariffs, keeping only steel, aluminum, and autos. It looked like retreat. It wasn't. It concentrated pressure on the most politically sensitive U.S. sectors while opening space for negotiation. Long-term, this strategy produces leverage. Diversification expands bargaining power. Employment stabilizes communities. Investment flows toward predictability. Industrial upgrading captures more domestic value. Supply chains become resilient. And here's the key point. Even if tariffs disappear tomorrow, these gains remain. This isn't reaction, it's correction. Which raises the real question. If every escalation pushes Canada closer to independence, what does continued pressure actually achieve? Because this isn't heading toward resolution, it's heading toward permanent restructuring. Corporate America already feels it. Companies embedded in cross-border supply chains are reassessing now. Unions are reacting. Politicians face conflicting pressures. Tariffs become harder to sustain politically over time. Washington may attempt selective carve-outs to slow Canada's shift. But globally, the signal is clear. Europe and Asia see opportunity. Neutral economies are watching. Canada becomes a template. Tariffs no longer guarantee compliance. They incentivize redesign, and that changes everything. So the final question isn't whether Canada's strategy is risky. It is. The question is whether dependence is riskier, because in today's global economy, independence isn't a slogan. It's a capability. What do you think? Does this strategy hold or does it backfire?